My name is Reine, Hanna, and it is an honor for me to moderate this morning's panel on Assyrian global governance. It's not news to anyone here that the current situation for Assyrians in the homeland threatens our existence. It's not news to anyone here that for the first time in our history, the majority of Assyrians are living outside of our lands. We're all aware that there is a great challenge ahead of us, one that oftentimes might seem impossible to overcome, so much so that we become numb to what's at stake, and all of us are left wondering what's next for us. That's what we're here to discuss today, but before we can do that, we have to ask ourselves if we truly believe in a future for our people. Do we believe in a future for Assyrians? And I think that for everyone in this room, the answer is yes. The fact that we're all here on a Sunday morning speaks to that. But if we believe in a future, we have to commit to it, and we have to recognize our role in securing it collectively, as activists, scholars, writers, researchers, as Assyrians. And with that said, I would like to introduce to you Michael Youash. Michael Youash is an Assyrian scholar and advocate who has worked extensively on issues of governance and security, specifically in relation to the Nineveh Plain in Iraq. He's an expert on questions of legislation and advocacy and has led and coordinated advocacy by the Assyrian community in the United States over the past decade. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Michael Youash.
I know we're pressed for time, and I am going to try and make this quick to allow for some questions. So you'll understand why I'm speaking at the level of principles, Sherwe, for global governance, and not talking about who's the leader, you know, how important California is in relation to all of France. But before I get there, I just want to repeat part of the message that I've been delivering, which is that it's been my analysis that this nation has operated for in excess of a century with the Assyrian question as foreign determination. As Professor Joseph Jakob's book defined for us in written form, since the League of Nations and even before, Assyrian organization for national benefit has been geared towards asking another nation to do something for us pursuant to making us a nation. And my goal is to snap us out of this, because for 1 century, this model has completely, utterly failed us. We need to turn the Assyrian question from foreign determination in our own minds into the Assyrian question, our pursuit of answering the Assyrian question as our act of self-determination, and reclaim our agency. I want to put the final nail in the coffin on my own onslaught of the Assyrian question as foreign determination. I've given lots of talks already, including at last convention, of 1 century of advocacy that even produced extensive legislation, but either left us with no benefit or even hurt. The last version is one that we're all engaged in, and commend everyone who was involved in it. And yet, let's be honest about what the last phase of advocacy did. On March 17, 2016, Secretary of State Kerry said, "My purpose in appearing before you today is to assert that in my judgment, Daesh is responsible for genocide against groups in areas under its control, including Yazidis, Christians, and Shia Muslims." A huge amount of effort went into that. A phenomenal, what's called a legislative lift went into finally getting the Secretary of State to say that. But what else did the State Department officially say? State Department officials said that the genocide designation, imposes no new obligations beyond what is already being done, but that it could galvanize other countries to step up and battle against the Islamic State. Literally no change in policy. Literally no change in policy. And the spokesperson actually said, "We have proven our willingness to step in and prevent acts of genocide." Meaning, the genocide resignation in his eyes is redundant. Is it going to trigger something new? No. That's the truth. of what genocide recognition achieved. All our advocacy. That's the outcome of the Assyrian question as foreign determination. Now let me first tell you what Assyrian global governance is not. The Assyrian Universal Alliance, established in 1968. Now you can go back and read all of their conference. It's a wonderful historical read of the progression of how we've been organizing. And it's a remarkable organization in terms of the breadth of its history and what it's done. But in their own words, their collectivization and their mobilization, the AUA diligently advocates the Assyrian cause internationally and promotes the aspirations of the Assyrian nation. It urges democratic governments and international bodies to defend the rights of the Assyrian people in their ancestral homeland, Iraq, and to preserve their national identity, cultural heritage, language, and religion. You can take all of that, hit Google Translate of what I'm talking about, and it comes out as Assyrian question is foreign determination. Alam Hanach Rabbi Ivan Kakovich, with the International Confederation of Assyrian Nation. Another heavy, heavy intellectual contribution to trying to grasp how we can reorganize ourselves globally. And yet at the core of everything that it was about was that the Secretary General is to prepare the Assyrian case for presentation and submission to a friendly government, member of the United Nations, etc., etc. The Assyrian question. So an entire global network of organizing only to produce what? The Assyrian question as foreign determination. And the latest phase, the Assyrian Parliament, which has dedicated itself to exploring, and I'm not going to unpack all the details, which I've done with them, engaged with them, but unpacked all the mechanics of how to set up a representative assembly. I work in legislative studies. I'm a PhD candidate in legislature design and constitutionalism. It takes an entire country with the entire international community backing it years to set up a legitimate representative assembly. And we want to do that effort so that this representative assembly can deliberate on the needs of our people and then present it to the international community. The Assyrian question as foreign determination. So that was what Assyrian global governance is not. It seeks to absolutely stamp out our belief that Nochraye are going to do for us what we don't try to do for ourselves. So what is it? Assyrian global governance is the reorganization of the Assyrian nation globally to begin developing and exercising our self-reliance. It really is that simple. And yet, I know it's completely daunting. Because we're all sitting here thinking we can't do anything, because that's what we've been conditioned to think. That's what 100 years of the Assyrian question as foreign determination has hardwired us to believe. Some Nukhraya has to come and save us. We are helpless, we are victims, we are under somebody's boot. We're not equal to others. Someone has to save us. We cannot save ourselves. We have to rediscover our agency. We have to rediscover our self-help capacity. Now, I'm very sure that when I say principles and governance, I've been told that nobody understands what the heck I'm talking about. So I know the majority audience here is American, and I'm going to render this as digestible as I can. Some years ago, just a few years ago, a room in Philadelphia was filled up with some of the most remarkable people in the world. I know they were men, but let's just say the most remarkable people in the world. And they innovated a document, the US Constitution, that was actually a contribution to global political, say, civilization in terms of the way to organize a society, right? But before they got in and said the Senate and the House, the judiciary and the state legislatures, and they discerned the principles that would guide them. They deliberated the principles before they discussed the detail. What would their constitution embody, as opposed to just sit around and say, let's create the government and then discuss what we're about. That's a disaster. So I'll give you one example. Fed 10, James Madison, large factions. You know who Americans are? Here's a thread, here's one thread of connectivity that we can extend ourselves as Assyrians to the earliest Americans, despite what they did to indigenous people in this land. The early Americans were people running from huge majorities that were oppressing them. The earliest Americans were people that were persecuted by other majorities. And they had something ingrained in their psyche. When a large group of people assume a large amount of power in government, they hurt others. This was just a principle. Large factions do harm. That's why you have checks and balances, and that's why you have separations of power, all you Americans. It's because of this principle. So they took that principle, and then they gave it institutional form. And so this is the stage where we're at with Assyrian global governance. Before we talk about what's this organization, and what's this federation, and who's this independent association, and Rabita this and Rabi that in terms of where the seats sit, no. We first discern the principles that will guide us. So I'm going to present some of them. This is not a finite list, and I'm putting this forward not as an authority, in absolutely the spirit of starting a conversation. And some of it's going to be contentious. As long as it's conducted respectfully, that's what this is about. I try to avoid what my Umtanaya brother Wilfred Bet Altas does in terms of provoking people into throwing chairs. Autonomy, sovereignty. It really is our decisional autonomy. One of the principles that has to guide us is our absolute drive to claim our capacity to make our own decisions. Now, what does this mean? So the best I can do for now is give you illustrations. At a certain point, post-liberation Iraq, after the fall of Saddam, at a certain point, the Kurdistan Democratic Party identified that it didn't like what the Assyrian Democratic Movement was doing, right? It didn't like it. It didn't like the policies. So what it did, through the Kurdistan Democratic Party's senior political member, Sergis Agajan, who was then also finance minister, they created a political party called Mejlis Shabi. Okay? They did that in order to challenge our capacity to make our own decisions. They wanted to claim our decisional autonomy. They wanted to take it away from us. So when you internalize the principle of decisional autonomy, you would immediately be able to identify that as a threat and understand that you're now under attack. Because this principle is guiding you. I'm not talking about institutional form yet, what this would look like in terms of how we organize ourselves, but I'm talking about the principles that guide us. This has a corollary here in the US. Foreign campaign contributions are illegal. Plain and simple. The US government tries to preserve its elected representatives' decisional autonomy from foreign interest. I'm not saying they're succeeded, but it is a principle. This is the exact same thing. That is the US government trying to prevent a Mejlis Shabi being imposed on them by a sultan somewhere. Right? Ganan Qaganan, Assyrians for Assyrians. We are on our own. We have to come to terms with that. The truth hurts, but we are on our own. And I don't want to preempt Afram Yaqub's presentation, but one example of that is the Assyrian organizations and organizational capacity in Sweden produced a situation where they pursued their interest, organized for their interest around themselves, and built themselves up to a point where at that threshold, the government of Sweden said, we can work with these people, and now we can back them too. So Ganan Qaganan doesn't mean we build up a wall and reject the world. It means we strengthen ourselves to the point where we can accept the world on our terms. Another example is the Nimue Plains Protection Unit. It's a force that was stood up by our people, independently by our people. And today, this isn't us. This Facebook post isn't us. I mean, it's our soldiers, but it's Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve. This is US military posting their work with the NPU. Why? Because their interest aligned with us. We did something for ourselves, it aligned with someone else's interest, there's a working relationship now. That's Ganan Kaganan. Indigeneity. Ours is a nationalism of reclamation. It is something that is not European nationalism that originated at a specific point in time in Europe and was the result of what can only be described as ultra-violence. I'm not saying it doesn't have some redeeming qualities and contributions, but overwhelmingly, if any of you have taken any history class, modern history, you've learned about world wars, you've learned about phenomenal horrid violence in the name of that specific form of national. Indigeneity is about transcending that and disconnecting from that visceral zero-sum conflict nationalism to a more elevated and higher level nationalism. So what are we talking about here? A standardized education that's global. The capacity to deliver a global education system that's standardized. An Assyrian education to Assyrians. From Turlock to Toronto to Tilke. At the same time, it's land return and resettlement. It's not land theft, it's not expansion, but it's reclaiming what's ours. It's not about hurting anyone else. It's about finding and reclaiming what was taken from us. Building on that, some of these principles graft onto one another. Non-territoriality. Indigeneity is absolutely all about territory. We come from Bet Nahren. That's our roots. That's who we are in terms of our identity and it having a territorial meaning. But we are also very much an indigenous people that are a diaspora nation now. And we need to find a way. We always talk about strengthening back home. We always talk about that. And all of you know I've dedicated much of my adult life to that. They have an asset and strength that we don't have. They're on the land. And that connection is so deep, we don't relate to it. We have so many things pulling us away from our identity. Because we're not physically on the land. So we need strength and empowerment too. In this, the best illustration I can give to you, operationally, is a lesson learned from the Ninwa Plains Province or Federal Solution in 2003 that was issued. And this is about navigating our non-territorial nationalism and our territorial nationalism. The policies used in Iraq and driven by groups in Iraq, pursuant to creating the Ninwa Plains Province, creating a triname, using identity in its most flexible sense, had repercussions for the diaspora that in some cases were devastating. Now, I'm not saying it's the wrong policy in Iraq. What I'm saying is we have to think about how policies are implemented in diaspora and in Atra in order to ensure that they're immune from the worst possible effects. Democracy. So simple. But literally, let me just say this. When I say democracy allows us to breathe and it allows us to live, it's literally this simple. Wherever Assyrians live and there is no democracy, we thin out completely. This is just a fact. The demographic decline is absolute. But now, if this is a principle that guides us, what does it mean when we exist in a world where Western governments, like the United States government, overtly support the autocrats, dictators, and tyrants who oppress us? It means we will have to organize to confront that. That the very Western governments in which we're free to be Assyrian are the ones that support the governments that oppress us and work with the governments that oppress us. The Assyrian Umtanaya and Umtaneta in Australia who can sit and innovate and work and have that freedom to live and breathe knowing that their house can't be taken from them, versus what exists in the Kurdistan region, and Nala, and everywhere else before Nala, and for the last X amount of decades. We have to understand that this idea of democracy, we would have to organize to exist, to fight for democracy, even against where we think democracy is already existing. That has to be a principle that guides us. And finally, realism. This is the most abstract, and I'll stop here. This principle, I would argue, doesn't need to exist in any conventional nation state or governing jurisdiction. Realism basically reflects the fact that in Assyrian politics, you can say pretty much anything. If you have a microphone, if you have a Facebook account, you can be, and here I'm talking about political representatives, are not accountable for what they say, right? If a senator gets up and she says something absolutely preposterous, absolutely preposterous, this entire group needs to go. Or I'm going to ensure that all schools are all absolutely free, or I'm going to abolish it. There are things that politicians in the United States absolutely cannot say because it's the end of their political career, because that lack of realism is so preposterous they'll be held accountable for it. Internally within our nation, this doesn't exist. Perfect example, a debate that took place after 2005 when one political agenda said, well, the Iraqi constitution pragmatically allows for the creation of what we think would be called an administrative unit. It's constitutional, you can sink your teeth into it, you can move it, you can argue it legally. Constitutionally, it seems realistic. The opposition to that were political groups that says, well, we're pursuing the Assyrian Triangle because that person's a sellout and we're the hardcore Tanai. Well, the Assyrian Triangle would be the entire upper half of Nineveh Governorate, all of Dohuk and half of Erbil. So this proposal for an Assyrian Triangle actually would mean Assyrians would govern just over 2.5, 3 million Sunni Arabs and about another 3, 4 million Kurds. Say what you will about your dreams for the Assyrian nation, but it's preposterous. But they can say that because there is no institutional way to check that and check that creation of false hopes for short-term political gain. That's a principle. But there's another element of realism that needs to be built in as a principle. Collectively rejecting external deceit. At a time when Assyrians were credibly moving ahead their agenda for a federal solution in Iraq, the Kurdistan regional government, which opposed that vision, said, oh, well, we'll grant you autonomy. Those people who are asking for a federal unit or even a province, that's nothing. We're going to grant you autonomy. In 1974, Saddam Hussein brought in Law number 33, the autonomy law for Kurdistan. There it is. Here you created the Kurdistan region, and it's called autonomy. You know what Mullah Mustafa Barzani did? He didn't party, didn't celebrate, he declared civil war and attacked Baghdad. Because he knew in the name of autonomy, it was death. It was actually an attack in the name of autonomy. So as a principle, because we don't exist in a territory, and because we don't have jurisdictions literally to govern this global structure, we have to build in realism, institutions. So this has to be a principle that guides us. So I'm going to stop there. I hope this only empowered you to think about the next steps of the conversation, the way it has to change up here first before we start changing the reality around us.
So, my goal in the time that I have here is to do as much as I can to convince you all of the necessity, merely of the necessity, of developing our own self-reliance and self-empowerment in order to survive as a people. Usually we understand urgency in quite friendly terms, scrambling to send money to militias and so on. But I think it's urgent that we begin, that we all, those of us who believe in this, and I hope that will be an ever-expanding, an endlessly expanding range of Assyrians, understand the urgency of changing how we think about ourselves and the Assyrian question. I will begin with a discussion of advocacy in relation to Assyrians, and I will then move to a discussion of what we are describing as global governance. But more than that term and any sort of specific organizational or branding detail or identity attached to it, it's far more important that we discuss the ideas and principles that undergird and define the effort itself. So in tandem with Michael's presentation to that effect, I'm also going to explore some of the collective psychological problems or impediments that I believe are stopping us from coming to the realization that we have to rely on ourselves. There is something I've observed which could be described as Assyrian exceptionalism, and it goes two different ways. It's a kind of bilateral phenomenon. It's a mixture of self-loathing and self-regard. The self-loathing consists of us not believing, or acting as if we do not believe, that we can do anything truly meaningful or lasting by and for ourselves, or that we should focus on developing our own capacities as a matter of urgency in response to our ongoing genocide. Right? And self-regard, because we continue to believe or act as if we do. And in terms of the precious time and energy we spend on working on Assyrian things, those two things mean the same thing in practice. That the justness, the righteousness, the moral and historical legitimacy of our cause should and therefore will attract support from the cry. Diaspora Assyrians who left circumstances of upheaval, tyranny, conflict, and who ended up in societies that are organized along, let's say, socially or morally or politically superior lines, continue to be seduced by our belief in the fundamental goodness of the societies in which we live. We are therefore seduced and flattered by the myth, the delusion, really, that we can, this goes back to the question of democracy, we can just keep ascending the ladder of power in these countries. Because since we do live in democracies, the door is open to us. And it's very easy to gain the impression, as an advocate, that there is a narrative ahead of you, that you just keep opening more doors and keep reaching more powerful people. And I think everyone who's been involved in these kinds of activities, especially anew, especially afresh, without studying what happened before, or taking a very serious look at what they are doing and what we are doing generally, will have received this impression, will have felt this. When we reach the very top, we will finally be heard by the same governments that have actually set in motion or directly created the conditions for our potential absolute demise as a people. And that merely by conveying our desires and needs in a sufficiently professional manner, that those desires and needs will be met eventually by a cry. To consider the question of, specifically of genocide recognition, and again, this is totally impersonal, so I'm not addressing any group in particular that has pursued genocide recognition. It would be impossible to do so because virtually every Assyrian organization and every Assyrian advocate has either sought genocide recognition of SAFO or the contemporary Assyrian genocide. So this is a fundamental and a general problem, right? To me, when you really think about what we are doing when we seek genocide recognition, I find it actually quite perverse. We know what happened, that what happened to us and what is happening to us is genocide. And we know that genocide recognition does not entail action. Yet, we place the weight of the simple opinion of powerful Nakhraya we hold that in such high regard that there was and is this absolutely collective yearning to hear, just to hear them pay lip service to what is actually the end of our people in material reality, material history. So again, we continue to labor in the belief through the example of genocide recognition. Genocide recognition is one powerful example of how we continue to labor in the belief that the actions of Western governments will finally morally align with the profundity of our cries to them. It's one among many myths that have been constructed within and about us, some of which we've created and some of which we've internalized. The real variable is how we advocate, for example. This is something that's all of us have frequently heard. So we're not sufficiently professional in our advocacy, in other words, or we use the wrong terms to describe the lands that we're from, right? Or we use the wrong names in describing ourselves, etc. If we just change these variables, then the result will be essentially the creation of something for us, right? And we are very keen to internalize and accept every excuse that is given to us by foreigners for not helping us. One of them is disunity. Again, something that we're all gruelingly familiar with as a subject, right? So, if you just look at the causes that the United States has supported recently, let's take the example of the YPG in northeast Syria, which is a force that does not represent all Syrian Kurds. Many Syrian Kurds have a problem with the YPG. The most politically organized forces that have a problem with the YPG are the very same forces, or affiliated with the very same forces, that America supports in northern Iraq, the very same Kurdish forces, right? So, I mean, the KDP and the PYD, the political sponsors of the YPG, are very much at odds, right? And yet the YPG has attracted very significant American support. The Syrian opposition to Bashar al-Assad currently consists of around 1,000 militias, politically supported by the United States, right? And yet, when American officials, European officials tell us, it's just, it's so confusing to us that some of you believe in one thing, and some of you believe in another thing, so we can't help you. Many Assyrians involved in advocacy really do believe this. And that again is a deep psychological, the same psychological condition, if you will, that leads you to seek their support, is the condition that will lead you to believe what they tell you in response to why we can't help you. So it simply isn't empirically true to say that our lack of unity has prevented us from attracting support. And yet sadly, we continue to injure ourselves by perpetuating this belief within our own people. We also look at other causes which appear to have been created or substantiated through the success of advocacy. Always an error. This is another really fundamental error that we make all the time. So, again, in the case of Kurds, we see that Kurds have a very slick and sophisticated lobby today, which they do, especially KDP Kurds. Especially KDP Kurds. And therefore we assume that the successes that Kurdish nationalists have had in northern Iraq are as a result of lobbying, which is also baffling when you look at the actual material, historical reality of the creation of the KRG in 1991 through Operation Provide Comfort. That was not the result of the phenomenon that we now see with the absolutely endless rotating cast of Kurdish and non-Kurdish lobbyists coming in and out of Congress people's rooms, right? It simply wasn't it wasn't a result of that. The Kurdish national cause had been armed, well, for as long as there were national causes, obviously, and before that. There was always a desire for autonomy expressed variously. It was granted to them in a proto form by Saddam Hussein. I mean, these are all and there were millions of Kurds in the same place. I mean, these are all things that led to the Western decision to intervene at a given time to create what what it thought would be or hoped would be, and has become essentially a client state of Western powers. It doesn't have to do with the fact that they're good. They know how to meet with. They know what to do once they walk into a room of Congress people. It simply doesn't have to do with that. Since 2003, they've had the luxury and the capacity to advance significantly their lobbying arm, but that's not why they're very powerful. It's as if the advocacy, rather than the self-empowerment, coupled with all sorts of other historical realities, is responsible for the success of Kurds. As Michael has shown, it's also true that we have succeeded ourselves in producing results within the terms expressed and defined by advocacy itself, legislation, language, even policy. What has failed is the results of the advocacy to actually help us. And when it comes to international legal language, seminars, conferences, etc., that's one tier of reality, that's one layer of the reality of international politics, and the other is on the ground, is what actually is happening. And we seem to fail to connect these things. We think that the level of language and resolutions and legislation and genocide recognition and so on can actually affect the way things take place on the ground, rather than it just being a very faint, really a faint shadow of the actual reality, which is what we perceive when you actually look at the nature of national causes and political causes. This isn't about a cessation of all advocacy and external engagement at all. But in relation to the subject of advocacy and lobbying, it is about a recognition that until and unless we empower ourselves, advocacy and lobbying will fail to produce results and waste desperately valuable time, energy, resources, and feeling, the actual emotion that leads us to work for our people. There is no model or precedent for what we are currently doing that has yielded results. You can't describe our current situation, which is one of organizational fragmentation, and all the other things that we're familiar with, but a very strong interest in advocacy that has worked. But what's striking, and something that many of us, almost all of us know this is true, but we don't seem to really care that it's true, that there are extraordinarily significant precedents for self-reliance that we might believe, for example, especially in the case of Jews, are down to lobbying success, but are actually very, very empirically clearly down to doing something like, at least operating under some of the principles, because obviously we're different from Jews and Armenians, Kurds, and so on. Our circumstances are different, our national character is different, our history is different, but the undergirding principle of self-reliance and self-empowerment, rooted in an understanding that only we being Jews, Kurds, Assyrians, etc., can help ourselves, and if we have to empower ourselves to a certain point before we can meaningfully engage with other people. These models have worked. I mean, if most people now, again, speaking of the Kurdish situation, look at Israel and believe that it was the creation of Western governments. I mean, this is obviously because there are many, many very, very stupid and dangerous ideas that have always existed about Jews and continue to exist. But in reality, the Jews faced extraordinary opposition to their century-plus attempt to empower themselves. At the point of establishing Israel, and before the establishment of Israel, they had all kinds of problems with Western powers. There was no sense in which this was something that was given to them in the reality of history. After incredible struggle, these peoples made their causes strong enough to deal substantially with external forces. And crucially, that engagement came at a time when they didn't absolutely need it. So they could afford to absorb the blows of betrayal and inconsistency. And we haven't been able to absorb those blows because we've relied fully on external patronage. So when it's evaporated, it's left us absolutely devastated, right? Over and over again. It's a pattern that we're all familiar with. So we miss out that middle passage. We simply fail to recognize how important and meaningful it would be for us, morally, operationally, practically, on every level, to self-organize along the principles that we are discussing. And this is a phrase that I have a problem with simply because it's a platitude, and it is quite flat. But we are a global nation. We've also failed to accept that. And what I mean by that is, if you're an Assyrian in Arizona, you have your local organization to deal with Arizona-related issues. Then you might be a supporter of United Kingdom or Azerbaijan or whoever, and that's the person that you look to deal with Iraq. And that's pretty much it, right? I mean, there's nothing greater than the sum of those parts. There's nothing which transcends that divide in any meaningful, agency-creating, organizational, institutional sense. And that is a very deep problem, especially given the fluidity of populations. So the mere existence of an Iraqi Assyrian, a Turkish Assyrian, and so on. I mean, all of these realities are under relentless threat. So dividing ourselves in this way, organizationally, no longer makes any sense. Even just in terms of our basic perceptions, we remain mired in this split between homeland and diaspora. And we absolutely lack the conception that it's possible to act as a transnationally sovereign entity, or at least have collective agency in that way. And that leads to an incredible waste of Assyrian potential in existence currently. Am I in trouble? We're all here because we love our people, but we're also aware that the basis of nationalism, national feeling, is deeply instinctive and survival oriented. So at the roots, am I in trouble? Yeah? 5 minutes, yeah? Less.
So you have one more speaker.
You have one more speaker, yeah? Okay, there's not much there. So the basis of nationalism is deeply instinctive and survival oriented. At the root, we know the reason that we associate with one another is that we know that there's a sense in which we care about ourselves more than anyone can care about us. Right? It's not even that dissimilar to the difference between a family member and a stranger. I mean, it's that deep, it's that visceral. We all feel that necessity, that survival instinct, but we don't organize along those lines. And that's another reason why there's an extraordinary waste of potential in existence. So I'm interested in an organizational alignment which reflects at its root that feeling that we all have. There's a huge gap between that feeling and how we actually operate and think as a people, collectively. The phrase non-territorial sovereignty is one that I like, but I know it's widely going to be perceived as very dry and detached, which it also is. In Surid, though, I was thinking, I came to this last night, Shultanuta ad la ara, right? I think it's more appealing. The empowerment, the assurances, the undergirding of a state without being attached to territory. And when I say not being attached to territory, that's a reflection of reality, but it's not about giving up on land at all. No Assyrian would ever abandon our attachment to our lands, or to sever our ties with our land and the permanent dream, which will never die, of Assyria. As it is a response, a necessary one, to successful genocides is really what we're interested in. We've had our agency taken from us by force. We've also willingly handed our agency over to Nukhraya with our expectation that they will come to our salvation because our cause is just, we deserve it, and because they are powerful. So what I'm talking about is not a specific project or an organization with a narrow, time-specific, task-specific mandate, nor do I believe what I'm talking about is optional. This is both an end in and of itself. Again, if you think about it like a state, I mean, a state is there as a fundamental purpose to preserve its citizens. But once a state is established, everything is possible beyond that. Once we have an organizational reality that actually understands, takes into account, and fully empowers us based on our reality as a global nation, that will forever serve as the means by which we maximize the strength of our connection to each other. So somebody asked me, what happens once Assyrian global governance is established? And my response was everything. Every single Assyrian endeavor, goal, project, idea is going to be reinforced and buttressed by this. At 4 today, Badri is speaking about the village of Mir, the Assyrian village of Mir. Imagine if you had 350,000 Assyrians in one group, backing and assisting and supporting a project like the rebuilding of Mir by internal consensus and legitimacy. Therefore, all these Assyrians feeling participant in what all other Assyrians do, right, which is what happens in a state. That's the kind of thing that I'm now interested in. I would like us to all think about the almost I'd like us all to think about the almost innumerably vast number of ways in which the citizens of countries, i.e. territorially bound countries, almost by virtue merely of existing within that state, reinforce and enable each other to survive and flourish. To take an extremely childish and crude example, essentially a symbolic one. Taxes go to public universities, they train engineers who build bridges across which you drive, right? That banal and outdated illustration is merely intended to convey a state of collective being that I wish to see with the Syrians, where every organizational success, every individual success, every project success directly empowers and assists and substantiates all the other efforts. I would also suggest that in many ways the territorially bound aspect of nationhood is in decline, institutionally, economically, technologically, and that's something that we should take into account and should serve as an additional spur for this idea. So, in conclusion, we've undergone decades, if not centuries, of being destroyed and uprooted, having our land, our culture, our people, our dignity taken from us. And we continue to lack the belief that we ourselves have the power and the freedom to rely on ourselves for survival. But if we finally build our own self-reliance and empowerment, because we have made it by and for ourselves, no one can take it from us. But that also means that if we fail to realize the necessity of self-reliance and self-empowerment as the only thing that can guarantee our existence, and we hope our flourishing, only we are to blame for it. Thank you.
We're now going to turn our attention to the projector here, where we will be bringing in Afram Jakob via Skype. He'll be joining us from Sweden. Unfortunately, he could not be here in person. Afram Jakob is the president of the Assyrian Federation of Sweden. The Swedish Federation boasts approximately 10,000 members, and Afram is currently in his 5th year as Federation president. So we're just getting set up here, and he will be our final speaker this morning.
I've been listening. I couldn't hear much of what Michael said, but I heard pretty much what Mardean was saying. And it's a very interesting topic. Actually, Sweden is a very good example of what Michael and Mardean have been mentioning. We have approximately 150,000 people of Assyrian origin living in Sweden. That makes 1.5% of the Swedish population. We have approximately 10,000 Assyrians organized in associations under the leadership of the Assyrian Federation of Sweden. We have 4 people of Assyrian background in the Swedish parliament. We have 1 person in the Swedish government, a minister. And for the past 2 years, we have had a period of intense lobby, with a lot of meetings with the Swedish politicians, Swedish ministers, members of parliament. Our cause as a people have been mentioned in Swedish media hundreds of times, in television, magazines, radio. And do you know the result of all of this? Zero. Absolutely zero. All of this Assyrian presence, lobbying, all of it has not resulted in any tangible help to Assyrians from a country as Sweden, which says about itself that it's a humanitarian superpower. So I think this testifies to the idea that Michael and Mardean have been speaking about. So this has become more and more apparent for us also as a federation here in Sweden, that this is very good work to try to cry for help, but most probably it will not result in attaining any help. And fortunately for us, we have been working also on sending help to Assyrians in Assyria on our own. We haven't only been crying for help, we have also tried to do some self-helping. So from day one, the Assyrian Federation of Sweden, and we have also another organization here which is called Assyrians Without Borders. I think we are responsible for more than 4 million Swedish kroner to have been sent to Assyria during the 2 past years. So this is something that the Assyrian community in Sweden has done on itself, self-reliance. We have been, as a federation, in constant contact with Assyrian organizations and individuals in Syria, in Iraq, some key persons, to try to help them or to give them ideas on organization, on strengthening their structures, on cooperation, and things like that. Some people here have also been instrumental in the creation or the idea of actually having our own forces, military forces in Syria and in Iraq. We cannot in Sweden take credit for all of that. There are many people involved, but we have been among the first to push this idea that we should rely on ourselves and we should have our own forces. I'm very happy for this. We have done this, this has come natural to us to work both ways, both to cry for help at the Swedish government and to do what we can on our own. But given that the results from crying for help is so low, is such a big zero, it's only natural and correct to rely even more on ourselves in the time ahead. There is no country in Europe where we are 1.5% of the population. Actually, there is probably not one single country in the Western world where we are more than 1% of the population. There's probably not any other country where Assyrians are so well known as a group as Sweden. If you ask any Swede, what's an Assyrian, who are the Assyrians, they can respond very well about our history and who we are. And yet, nothing, no help from the Swedish government. So, that's basically what I have to say. Maybe I can say a few words about why the necessity of having strong federations. From our experience here in Sweden, we can see that federations tend to gather people much more than, let's say, churches or political parties. The Assyrian Federation of Sweden, our 10,000 members, they are made up of Assyrians from Syria, from Iraq, from Turkey, from Iran. We have Assyrians who speak Western Assyrian, Eastern Assyrian. We have those who don't speak any Assyrian. We have those who are very religious, those who are secular. We have those who are members of the Church of the East. We have those who are members of the Syriac Orthodox Church, etc. Any kind of Assyrian you can imagine, we have them as members in our federation. And if you look at our churches, they only gather a segment of the population. And if you look at our political parties, they can only gather a segment of the population. So a federation in that respect has advantages. It can really gather the community in a country and represent the community, and it can organize the collection of resources of the community, be it human resources, material resources, any kind of resources. We have a command central, basically, that can organize the community and to get more help to our people in Assyria. Did I forget anything, Martin?
Very, very good, I think.
Yeah. So I think that's what I had to say. I don't know if you can hear me clearly, and
Yeah, we can.
yeah. So
Thank you, Efraim.
you're welcome.
And so we are.
So, where do we start? Because it sounds like we're starting from scratch, and I'm unlearned about self-reliance of countries and self-determination and how it all starts? Is it education? Is it just spreading this ideology? Is it the Nineveh Plains province? And then furthermore, in terms of the Nineveh Plains province, isn't that under Iraq's central government? How does that fit in with this whole idea of self-reliance and so on?
Where do we begin?
We're gonna send Anthony on another road trip.
More than happy.
So, this is an excellent question because it allows me to conclude with an operational step that we are on the brink of taking. So, there are some people in this room, I'm going to isolate the president of the Assyrian American Association of San Jose, for example, okay, Ms. Rochelle Yousafian, has been digesting these ideas for months now. You know, it's a conversation with the leader of an organization that is a standalone, independent association in San Jose, is an affiliate of this federation, right? Who's being exposed with these ideas. And what we are on the brink of doing is this federation, Assyrian American National Federation, Shota Puyate, that are not part of this. There's somebody in this room who's a member of the Assyrian Foundation of America. Back in Illinois, there's a Chamber of Commerce. There's this Assyrian National Council of Illinois. But as Afram said, federations and then other organizations that are not affiliated, this is the structure that we work with, that we build on top of, okay? Now, we know how weak they are. We know how many challenges we face, as Mardean laid out. But the first step, and the reason why I discuss these principles, is because these are the entities that have to confer the mandate for the brains. And I will make it this simple, and I don't want to convey any arrogance or hubris in saying this. But the people who got together in Philadelphia and forged the United States Constitution were nonetheless given a mandate by states that were failing and dying under the Articles of Confederation. But each state viscerally was in conflict with others. They didn't like each other. They didn't work well together. They were being exploited by their enemies to their own demise. But they mandated people to come together and start forging solutions and bring it back to them. That's the stage that we're at. So, not to put anyone on the spot, but this exercise and broadcasting on television, putting it with you and getting the communication out there, is to get to our organizations and our federations to give us the mandate. Okay? ANB SAT, Mr. Ninos Turnian, is someone who, from the onset of this, came and said, I have a question. How do we get at something bigger, something larger than ourselves right now? He didn't have answers, he just had questions, and is pushing that. And more are coming together, but we're at the stage where we need the organizations to give us a mandate. And then what will happen is, if that mandate can be conferred by a certain threshold of federation, so the Assyrian Federation of Sweden, the European Confederation is intent on exploring this option and giving us that mandate and to report back to them on what we think we can design.
Thank you. And for our final question, I think in the back.
All right, so this is sort of an elephant in the room, but I don't want it to be an elephant in the room. I think it's important to address and to bring out into the light is that the majority of Assyrians are given that self-esteem through their church organizations. And Mardean was talking about, we're asking others to do for us what, we can be doing for ourselves. Sometimes that's being implicitly taught through religious organizations. So part of the organizations conferring this mandate to move forward needs to include this strong backbone of church leaders and groups who will actually support and will have a theology that's robust enough to support the need for Assyrians to band together. And so what I would like to just ask is it possible to think about ways to inspire, encourage, and get all the different religious traditions to move forward together so that these one world initiatives can move forward?
There are so many premises and claims that you've just issued that I have quite serious problems with. It's hard for me. I don't know where to begin really. Except I'll say this, maybe. Obviously, questions of theology and so on have nothing to do with this. That's quite clear, right? Churches themselves are already sovereign entities of sorts, aren't they? Right? I mean, I don't know what this would have to do with why this would need to involve itself with bringing churches together, for example. I mean, the very existence of a church presupposes a difference from another church. And churches operate quite autonomously and in quite a sovereign manner already, I think. So I think, I'll give a partial answer because there's a lot more to discuss.
And I'll actually add on that. So one thing that we have to, and we're talking about the uniqueness of our history too, right? So we're not, nothing of what I'm saying should connote that I'm replicating Philadelphia or that anyone is replicating the creation of Canada in terms of federalism, let's say. But in terms of our own history, let's understand that our own sectarian differences have been used by outsiders to destroy us, right? It's been an avenue of insertion. I'm not saying it's the churches. I'm saying outsiders use sectarianism to divide us. Let's make something clear here. We're living in a country right now that has used sectarianism elsewhere to divide peoples. This is not something that just one group does to another, does to us. This is something that groups do to groups, right? So we need something that transcends all of that, that closes the avenue for that type of exploitation and persecution. But I will say this, inasmuch as this is a dream, my dream would be that every church says your obligation is to get under this when you go home. Thank you.